Hello, and welcome to this edition of the 2020 Capitol Hill Lecture Series. I'm Roger Ream, President of the Fund for American Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. For a number of years, the Fund for American Studies has worked with Senator Rand Paul to bring these interesting and enlightening programs to Capitol Hill interns, congressional staff, and others who are interested in learning about the ideas contained in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Today, we have a fascinating program. Senator Rand Paul will be interviewing his colleague, Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Senator Paul was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2010 from Kentucky. He and his wife, Kelly, last year authored The Case Against Socialism, a fascinating book that looks at the crimes of socialism, from the Soviet Union and the Gulag to Venezuela. Senator Paul practiced ophthalmology as a doctor in Kentucky for many years before answering the call to public service and being elected to the U.S. Senate. We are so pleased to be sponsoring these programs with Senator Paul. If you'd like to learn more about the Fund for American Studies, visit our website at dcinternships.org, where you can learn about the programs we organize for high school and college students and young professionals throughout the world. And now, without further ado, Senator Rand Paul.
Good morning, everybody. We've been having an intern series now for about 5 years, and we've been having great crowds, sometimes 400 and 500 interns, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents, all across Capitol Hill. And it's actually been one of the things I've been most excited about, because we're able to talk about the ideas of freedom and liberty to a big crowd, and particularly a bipartisan crowd. I'm lucky today to have Senator Mike Lee here with me, and we came into the Senate together in 2010. I think we were both sort of a movement that was arising at the time, and this was called the Tea Party movement. And interestingly, people say, what was the Tea Party movement? Did it come about because of Barack Obama? Was it a reaction to Barack Obama? And actually, probably predated him a little bit, but really I never saw it so much as a reaction to him. I saw the Tea Party movement as a reaction to Republicans, to big government Republicans, who had primarily and significantly voted for the biggest bailout in the history of our country, the bank bailout at that time. And that was something that the Tea Party was very opposed to. The media to this day still doesn't get it. The media says, oh, no, y'all just hated Barack Obama and you were hate this. It really was a reaction to Republicans. And so my first question for Senator Lee is to see any parallels to that now as we voted for, we're getting ready to vote for another $1 trillion in spending, or borrowing is a better way of putting it. Do you think there's a possibility? Is there anything left in the Republican Party? Is there enough of a grassroots presence out there that there'll be a reaction to the hypocrisy of voting for so much spending?
Whether there's a reaction from within the Republican Party or not, there will be a reaction, and it'll be significant. Because whenever government grows, it does so at the expense of individual liberty. It's an inevitable law of nature. Government, best understood, is collective, coercive force. And it's best that we not dress it up as being anything cuter than that. It just is that. And so, yeah, I do see some parallels here. This is different in many respects than what happened a decade ago. The coronavirus response bills are different in their cause, but also different in magnitude than the bank bailouts of a decade ago. Nevertheless, I think it's important to emphasize some of these points, and especially your point is I feel exactly the same way. You and I came into this at the same time, and I think for very similar reasons. My reaction is exactly the same as Rand's. At the time, I was neither surprised nor particularly troubled by what Democrats were doing as much as I was by members of my own party. It's not that I was any less bothered by the government policy at stake. It's that for Democrats, this was what they had campaigned on. Barack Obama did exactly what he promised he was going to do. This was not how Republicans had campaigned, and it's not what we purported to stand for. And in my case, it's what caused me to leave a career that I found very interesting and rewarding and that allowed me to live a sane life and to get into this business. But then again, that's how I met my friend Rand, so it was all worth it.
I think you're right in the sense that Democrats campaign on the mantra or the platform that really deficits don't matter, and that they want this new monetary spending, this new monetary theory, and that really you can run up deficits as high as you want. The difference is Republicans, for 8 years of President Obama, said he spends too much and he borrows too much, and they went around beating their chests and saying this, but it turns out they don't really believe it. Think of the magnitude of the debt that's going to be accumulated in a short period of time. Between, some of us were unhappy with George Bush's addition to the debt. He went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion over an 8-year period. Barack Obama went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion over an 8-year period. In 6 months, we're going to add $5 trillion worth of debt in 6 months. And there have been people warning that when your debt approaches your GDP is like, 18 trillion or so, and when it becomes sort of 100% of that, and that's where we are, we're at 100% or more of our GDP. Our debt's now bigger than our economy. So it is very worrisome where we're getting. I think Mike hit the nail on the head when he said, well, why do you care how big government is? The big government sort of is inversely proportional to your liberty. And I think that's exactly true. And sometimes people don't get it because people think liberties are like your religious freedom and your ability to speak. But liberty is also to be able to act, work as you please, the earnings that you receive, to spend them. They're yours. And so if I tax you at 100%, I think you're 0% free, because how can you be free if you don't have any control over your labor or the products or fruits of your labor? And this is true in varying degrees, too. So if I tax you at 50%, you're 50% free. And so there is a liberty argument that goes along with how much a government taxes you as well. But now we've gone one step further than that. And we're having all types of constitutional battles, and I'll be interested in hearing Senator Lee's perspective on this. In our state, our governor banned the ability to go to church. He was struck down. He banned the ability to cross state lines. He was struck down. He's mandated quarantines of 14 days, and now people are mandating masks. And I guess my question to you would be on some of the different mandates that governors are getting. People acknowledge that states have more power, more police power than the federal government has, but do they have a right to make these universal sort of dictates with regard to business or personal behavior? And what limits them?
Generally speaking, no, they don't. They don't have anything universal. Now, there is a difference between a state government and the federal government, in that state governments are governments of what I call general jurisdiction. They can, generally speaking, make laws and then enforce laws on a wide range of topics, whereas we are limited to those powers that are enumerated in the Constitution and made federal. So things like national defense, a uniform system of weights and measures, laws governing immigration and naturalization, laws governing bankruptcy, establishing postal roads, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. And then there's my favorite power of Congress, one that Senator Paul and I have yet to exercise, but I hope to at some point in our Senate careers, the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal.
You're not supposed to use those against fellow Republicans.
Against fellow Republicans, exactly. We're going to reserve those for our foreign military adversaries. But marque here is spelled M-A-R-Q-U-E, and a letter of marque and reprisal is basically a hall pass that entitles the bearer to engage in state-sponsored acts of piracy on the high seas with utter impunity. And someday, regardless of how long I might serve in the United States Senate, I'm going to get a letter of marque and reprisal. I'm going to be a pirate with a flag and a parrot, and you're all invited to join.
What about the intersection, though, of rights that we say the states have more power and less limits, but then there are Bill of Rights that have been applied for the most part to the states, and so the First Amendment's been applied to the states for a long time. And so in our state, our governor's telling people they can go to their local liquor store, but they can't go to church.
Right. So those liberties, the thou shalt nots of the Constitution in the first 10 amendments, many of them have been deemed incorporated as against the states, applicable and enforceable against the states. And so many of those same liberties are being impaired in one way or another by these sweeping gubernatorial orders. For example, you saw the state of Kentucky and also some municipalities within the state of Kentucky cracking down on people holding church services, even drive-through Easter church services. Fortunately, this fantastic Kentucky federal judge, who Senator Paul and I have gotten to know, Justin Walker, issued a brilliant opinion on that front and made clear that that's unconstitutional. But even separate and apart from those areas where a governor acts contrary to an explicit constitutional prohibition, it still is something that we should worry about from a liberty standpoint when they exercise these sweeping powers. When they say, I hereby declare that you can't go to work, or that you've got to wear a mask, or a mask and a green hat and a face shield, or whatever it is that they want to do. For the simple reason that, number one, you don't always know what state statutory or state constitutional authority pursuant to which they might be acting. In fact, they often don't know. If you dig into these things, very often they're just airballing this stuff. Not all the time, but sometimes they are. It's important to ask those questions. It's also important to ask, to the extent you're intruding on my liberty, even if it's not something that is constitutionally prohibited, and even if you do have statutory and or state constitutional authority to do what you're saying, is this intrusion into the liberty of the citizenry worth it? I think we've lost, as a society, the tendency to engage in this kind of critical thinking with regard to our government. We have societally been conditioned to accept the idea that government knows best. And I think it's important for us to push back on that. And I'm not saying violate the law. And I'm not saying, go and tear stuff down or riot. What I am saying is we ought to ask the difficult questions and make government officials answer. Because ultimately, when a government tells you to do something, they're asking you to do it at the point of a gun. Whether you see the gun or not, it's still there.
What about the idea of the government putting ankle bracelets on people before they've had a trial or a court trial at all? So, for example, we had a couple who were tested positive, and they willfully said, yeah, we'll go stay at home, but the governor said, no, you must submit to my will and you must sign this piece of paper. Well, the piece of paper said that anytime they left their house, they had to get permission. They said, well, we have a child. If they're choking and we want to go to the emergency room, do we have to call first? And that's what the paper said, and they took the paper to mean something because their name was going to have to be attached to it. They refused to sign it. They were slapped with an ankle bracelet and basically convicted of a crime by the public health director. And they're being held at home, under home arrest basically now, but they've had no trial, no appearance before a judge or a court.
Well, wait a minute. What was the underlying alleged offense? Was this kidnapping, murder?
No, it was that they were sick. They had flu. They had the coronavirus.
Okay, so an allegation that they had the illness was the basis of their being forced to sign something or alternatively submit to ankle bracelet monitoring?
Most people don't realize this. When you're tested with the nasal swab, it's a PCR test. It's for remnants of the virus. It's not proving the virus is alive. You can actually have it. That's why some people have it a week or two later, and they're like, oh, I'm all better, and they still have a little bit of it. It's remnants of the virus. It doesn't prove you still are infectious or that you have it. So even the science behind this isn't enough to say someone is contagious, because no one is proving that you have a live virus. But it still is remarkable what they've done to these people, and I think it's this intimidation, this bully factor of government that, yes, we ought to push back. So I'm interested in your opinion on that, I guess, preemptively giving people an ankle bracelet. But then also the governor of Michigan, who decides that you can buy, clothing or deodorant or detergent, but you can't buy seeds. So she arbitrarily went down through the whole list of things that you might want in your life and said you can have this and you can't have that. And just the arbitrary nature of government deciding what you can buy. Well, you can have liquor, but you can't have religion, And you can go to a big box store like Walmart, but you can't go to Joe Smith's box store, because somehow Walmart got an exemption because they're a big store and was able to get through the paperwork to get the exemption.
Ordering somebody into home quarantine, as sounds like happened with this couple in Kentucky, it would be a little bit more understandable, perhaps, if we were talking about Ebola or something like that. It seems like an excessive reaction. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not not a COVID-19 denier. I don't dispute that this is a significant public health threat. It is not something like Ebola, where if you get it, you've got a really, really high chance of dying. And that seems to me to be a strongly disproportionate reaction. Right. And it's the kind of thing that happens when a society is taught over the course of many decades and ultimately generations to just trust government. Government knows best. Government has experts, and experts know what they're doing. So you little peasants, don't worry about that. Let us make the big decisions.
It's also complicated in the sense that many asymptomatic people aren't really good spreaders of this. That's what they've found with children. In Europe, you come out of your quarantine when you've been symptom-free for 7 days. Well, what if you never had symptoms to begin with? You see what I mean? So there's a lot of things that the science isn't exactly clear on this, and there's prudence and there's persuasion, and I can give you advice that maybe you should stay home for 2 weeks. But the thing is it really ought to be advice and persuasion. The same way if a vaccine comes on, I'm not anti-vaccine, but I think you should take it by persuasion, by looking at the results and me saying, well, it's a good idea, as a doctor giving you the advice, but I don't think it should be through force.
Gentle persuasion is always better than coercive force. So as far as you know, when you and I had lunch in March, and then 2 days later, your COVID-19 test results came back positive. As far as you know at that point, you were still asymptomatic. As far as you know, you may have had inactive remnants of the virus in you. As far as you know, you may not have even had the virus at that point.
I have no idea. The other thing is that in all my interactions, inadvertent, while I didn't know that I had the virus, nobody got sick, not one. I'm fairly prominent. I met a lot of people, and I think someone would have said, oh, I met him and I got sick. And so it's not to say that there's no danger in asymptomatic, but I think there's a little difference. And historically what we did is we used common sense. If you're coughing up your guts and you're coughing up the flu and you're bringing up stuff, you're obviously very contagious. If you are not sick, what are the chances that you're spreading this? I think actually very little. And this is a debate, and it's made science into politics in the sense that they're trying so hard, and the media every day is going overboard saying, oh, if you're asymptomatic, you're still possibly a spreader. Well, the likelihood is actually very, very small, and they've done contact tracing with children, and they find that children in 4 large countrywide studies, China, Netherlands, England, and Iceland, they find little, if any, spread from children back to parents, because the children just don't get sick enough to spread it.
That's significant, and that plays into the second question you asked me about the discretion exercised by government officials, especially governors, in saying things like, you're sufficiently important in what you do for a living, you may operate. You are not. This is essential, this is not. You may sell seeds, but not paint. Or I'm not sure what the other examples were. But that sort of thing really makes me nervous. And I wish it made more people nervous. I think your generation is going to be better at the liberty thing than my generation has been, because you're seeing it play out right now in a way that will leave an indelible impression on your minds. And I think this is something you'll pass along to your children and your grandchildren. It really is a dangerous thing when you start to just relinquish to government the discretion to decide who is essential and who is not, who gets to operate and who doesn't. You may open today, you may not open today, but I might decide that your business can operate tomorrow. That conditions us for a form of government to which no human being should be subject. That's dangerous stuff, and we need to recognize it as such.
There's an important practical argument here, too, and this is what Hayek talked about when he talked about the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit is the idea that there can be enough knowledge in a Politburo or a group of experts in one place. 5 or 10 really smart people in Washington can know enough about the knowledge of the economy to direct and plan it. And there's a really good little pamphlet that I have my interns read called iPencil, and it's by Leonard Read from the 1950s. And then he talks about the manufacture of a pencil, and you think, oh, that's so simple, anybody could do it. Well, it turns out there's an eraser, there's glue, there's wood, there's metal. All these things have to come together in this delicate dance where someone actually makes a profit on a pencil they sell for 2 pennies. And then you think, well, government could do that. Well, what happens is, because government's not directed by profit, at each one of those little stages, government takes something like building a pencil and can't do it. But it's this idea and it's this mistake of letting too much knowledge come central, and that's sort of what's happening during this virus, is that we're sort of giving up on the idea that the market knows best. And when you say the market knows best, it's you know best. Each individual knows best. And each individual transaction is so big that no powerful computer could compute all of it and understand it, because it's based on human behavior and based on humans wanting to make a profit at every step. And profit is a good thing, and this is the thing that's so upside down in our schools, is that we teach that capitalism is evil and profit is bad. The reason that we have extraordinary wealth in our country is everyone strives to maximize their profit and everybody works for self-interest for their family. And then the remarkable thing is that in working for self-interest for you and your family, it actually creates great wealth for the community as well. So the goal is not for the collective, the goal is for the individual, but the collective benefits by this invisible hand of capitalism. And I think we're losing that. We're losing it right now in the midst of fear. We're also losing it in general, in the sense that people are, think, oh, well, it just happens, and we just create this wealth, and they don't understand where the wealth comes from. Do you want to conclude with that, or do you want to say anything, and then we'll go to questions?
Yeah, sure. Mark Twain supposedly once wrote to a friend, "I wish I had had more time to write this letter. If I had had more time to write it, it would have been shorter." And the conclusion there, as any writer knows, is that if you've got more time to think about something, the product is going to be better if you're able to make it shorter, even though intuitively, at first blush, you might think more time equals longer letter. Sometimes things with government are also counterintuitive. We're asked to believe that if something is important, that means we're going to elevate it to the possession and control of government. In fact, most of the media, and I mean basically every television news network, basically every newspaper in America, and most institutions of higher education will teach you that in one way or another. Sometimes some things are so important that you don't want to put them in government because they're that much more important. And what Senator Paul is saying is absolutely true. The individuals, when we say the market, we really mean individuals. Individuals acting collectively and in pursuit of their own well-being and that of their family can do a whole lot more than government can most of the time. Government's really good and uniquely empowered to do a small handful of things. Most of them involve, breaking things and blowing things up, and so you don't want to trust them too much with too many things. Leave it to the people, and you're going to be better off.
Yeah, and the rule of thumb is that government does nothing well, so we should only let government do the things that the individuals can't do. A national defense, for example. There are a few examples, but there are very few. It's almost always the answer that what they do will be more expensive than would be done privately and less efficient. Why don't we do some questions? We'll do one at a time, and then we've got a microphone. If you don't mind pulling your mask down to do the question, I think we'll be able to hear the question better. And for people like me that read the lips, it's easier.
Stand up. Yeah. Thank you for being here. My question is, I care a lot about the courts. In your opinion, what would be the best judicial philosophy to promote individual liberty? Textualism, originalism, purposivism?
Definitely not purposivism. And let me explain what I mean. So textualism and originalism are in some ways sort of two sides of the same coin. Textualism refers to a very simple concept, which is that judges are there to look at the words that comprise the law and decide what those words mean, what their original public meaning was at the time they were made law, and they apply that. Originalism is a form of textualism manifested and applied in the context of constitutional language, where you're looking at a constitutional provision, you want to look at the original public meaning of those words at the time they were drafted, and put into the Constitution, either with its original drafting or in the case of a constitutional amendment at the time of the amendment. Purposivism, by contrast, is something that involves an effort subjectively to discern the subjective intent of whoever made the law at the time and the broad purpose of the law as the jurist might perceive it. This may sound like a subtle distinction, but it's a really important one to make. Judges are quite good and equipped with the tools of performing the textualist originalist task. They're not good and they're unpredictable when it comes to a purposivist task. So that's the principle. Here's why it matters. In the federal system, we put judges in place for life. So long as they're acting on good behavior and they're not impeached and removed, which is a difficult process, rarely happens, they're in there for life. They're not elected by the people. They're not accountable to anyone who was in turn elected. And they're there not to perform a task that involves popularity. They're there just to tell you what the law says, and that's their only job. And when they start deciding what the law should be rather than what the law is, they thwart the entire representative component of our system of government. They make it less of a republic and more of a judicial oligarchy.
So when they're interpreting a case, like in the recent Bostock case, they're looking at the language of what the words meant at the time and what they thought they were accepted. Should they also look at what the legislative intent or what the legislators meant by the words that went into the law, like the debate over the law and how it was enacted?
Generally speaking, no. Because insofar as what you're describing is the subjective mindset of the individual lawmakers, that's not really the point, except insofar as that might shed some light as to the original public meaning of the words themselves. But we shouldn't care about what any one lawmaker or group of lawmakers thought they were saying, because that isn't the point. It's what the original public meaning of the law was.
Thanks so much to both of you guys. So I tend to believe that with the right amount of research, the average American would find themselves aligning more with the conservative agenda. Would you say that's accurate, and how can we instill a greater interest into government for the average citizen?
You know, I think that there's a difference between right and left on whether or not we believe that people are capable of making decisions and coming to good conclusions. I tend to think that from the left, it's very elitist in the sense that they think it's not so important because you're not smart enough to make these decisions, that really government needs to make these decisions for you. So like on healthcare, they say, well, if you're left to your own devices, you might buy inexpensive healthcare and you might not buy good healthcare. I tend to be the opposite. I think the consumers are quite smart, even on something as sophisticated as whether a vaccine works. I think individuals can make those decisions, and a free society should. And I think there's plenty of information out there. I'm a physician, but I never approached a patient or a patient's family with the belief that I had knowledge that I couldn't explain to them to help them make a choice. I think even the most complicated of healthcare decisions, in fact, I tell people all the time, I told somebody yesterday, they said, what advice do you give me? And I say, if your loved one is sick, really sick with this virus, and there's decisions to be made, do not lay back and just let the doctor make all the decisions. You have to take the doctor's advice to a certain extent, but you need to push back and ask questions and say, well, you know, what happens if we don't go on the ventilator right now? Can we go another day? Can we try another day or two? Could we try this or that? What are the options you have at this choice? Because most doctors will tell you things aren't black and white. There's an option, and it's like they're making sort of an educated guess. It's time to go on the ventilator, and they've actually changed their decision-making on that. They were putting everybody on the ventilator, and now they're waiting longer and longer because it turns out the ventilator is somewhat damaging to the lung. It saves your life, but can also damage the lung. So I tend to think that people are smart enough to make decisions, and really it's sort of the freedom argument. The freedom argument is it's not my business to make all your decisions. In a free society, you may make good decisions, bad decisions, but that's the choice of the individual and families, and you're rewarded when your decisions are better. And so there's a self-reinforcing mechanism to try to drive us all to better decisions.
Thank you both for being here. I was curious, you mentioned some of the overstep we've seen from governors in the coronavirus crisis. However, the fact that people maybe are now paying attention to their state offices more, to the state government more, do you think that might be a positive thing in the long run for federalism?
Sure. I think it is. I love federalism. In fact, federalism and separation of powers are the two reasons why I got into this business. They are the twin structural protections of the Constitution. Federalism protects us on a vertical axis, separation of powers on a horizontal axis. And I celebrate anytime anybody acknowledges federalism. And lately you see a lot of Democrats and Republicans, sometimes for different reasons, talking about federalism today in a way that they weren't 6 months ago. Some people who are upset by orders issued by a mayor or a governor or a county executive regarding masks, it gets them thinking about the accountability of their local governments. You've also got liberals and Democrats who are freaking out about the deployment of federal law enforcement personnel to cities and states, perhaps against their will. They're talking about federalism too. It's good to have the discussion, regardless of where you conclude they may be right or wrong on the merits. It's good to have the discussion. I love people making the distinction between state power and federal power. Because for a long time we've acted almost as if states were political subdivisions of the federal sovereign. They are not. They are dual sovereigns. They are, in fact, the primary sovereign unit within our Republican form of government.
And there's a great irony to this, because those of us on the right have been big believers in the 10th Amendment and those powers, not granted or reserved for the states and people. And so this idea of federalism is very much an idea from the right, not the left. The left has federalized crime. We have thousands of federal crimes now. Every day they're trying to say, we need to make it a federal crime to do this, when the states are really where crime and ordinary crime should be managed. So now the left, particularly in Portland, is like, why are the federal police here? And I talked to somebody yesterday from Oregon, and I said, well, you realize your side's been federalizing everything. You've given access to the federal government to your city because you've federalized everything. And they don't quite get that. They're just mostly unhappy with President Trump. Now, I do have some sympathy for their argument. There is no constitutional police power to have a federal police force that goes around the U.S. In fact, my father was one of the few who opposed the Department of Homeland Security because he thought it would lead to internal spying, lessening of our rights, and it would become a bloated bureaucracy. All of those have become true. But we do need to be wary of it. But here's the thing does that mean I have any kind of sympathy for marauders and rioters and people burning down the courthouse? No, they need to be punished. Someone's got to stop them. But in the end, what has to happen is, maybe it does, as your question brought up, bring more attention to those offices. Why do you keep electing Democrats to run your cities? The Democrats have run Minneapolis since 1972. So they allowed this one policeman to stay on the police force with 18 accusations of aggressive force. But who did that? The Democrat mayor, the Democrat prosecutor, the Democrat attorney general, the Democrat governor. Portland, run by Democrats. Seattle, run by Democrats. All of our big cities run by Democrats. And so people have to ask a question, are they running our cities very well? And you say, well, what do we do about it? It's tricky. They're saying that the federal officials are defending the courthouse, but if they're across town, in the middle of a protest movement and they get caught up. Policing is a hard business. I have a lot of sympathy for policemen. They get in the middle of something and they have to balance the First Amendment right to protest, to be in the street, shouting, yelling, praying, whatever you want to do, you're allowed to do that in our country. But then when it turns violent, we have to stop the violence. So you have to protect both the First Amendment and the peace at the same time. So being a policeman is very difficult. The problem with federal officers is, one, there's not a constitutional mandate to send federal officers out there. The federal officers in the courthouse work inside the courthouse to protect the federal courthouse. But routinely, arson, graffiti, jaywalking is taken care of by the local community. So it would be something new. And I think in the end, the backlash to having federal police in our cities, I think the backlash is actually going to hurt President Trump, because it's going to call attention away from who it should be called to, the local mayor and the local city who are inept and they're letting things burn. Portland's been burning for 55 days. The blame should go to the mayor of Portland. But once we send federal troops in, if people get roughed up, and inevitably somebody will, they may be violent or whatever, but someone's going to get roughed up, then it's going to be blamed all on Trump, and it takes away from the argument that who's running the city, who allowed this to happen. So I think it's a mistake politically and also perhaps constitutionally to have too much of a federal police force.
Hi, so one of the common topics of discussion among the interns in Senator Lee's office is the 17th Amendment. So my question for you guys is just, what are some of the pros and cons you see with the 17th Amendment, and should ultimately we repeal it?
Man, who invited Senator Lee's staff here? I mean, his intern. The 17th Amendment, we get this all the time, and everybody knows what the 17th Amendment, right? It's a direct election of senators. And there are people who believe in states' rights, who believe that there was more, people were more attuned to their state's needs and things through the legislature. But historically, they also turned out to be people bribed state legislators, because you only had to bribe 20 of them to become the U.S. Senator. The other argument I have is that I never would have become senator had there been a vote through the legislature. The whole legislature was for the other guy, because he was the establishment, he was the party. I'm kind of assuming the same probably would have happened with Mike. So I guess from a personal point of view, I have sort of this, negative approach to going. I don't think we're going to go back to appointed senators. There was corruption, but also I think you get the insider, because state legislators have the same thing we have up here. They have a group that are the establishment, they are the status quo, and if you really want change, and Mike and I think were change agents, we were people who thought our party wasn't conservative enough or doing enough. I think you only get us in extraordinary, and I think Mike's was an extraordinary thing when he won and beat an incumbent, and mine was somewhat extraordinary in beating a sitting Secretary of State in our state. So count me as a no. Mike?
There's no question that something changed the minute we adopted the 17th Amendment, because no longer did you have one chamber of Congress under the control of people chosen exclusively by the states as states, by the state governments, by the state legislatures. So something definitely did change. And, it's been roughly during the same time period that you've seen an explosive growth of the federal government. We ratified the 17th Amendment in 1913, and it was only a couple decades after that you saw the explosive growth of the federal government start. Still, I think, number one, we probably still could have contained it had we respected federalism and separation of powers, and had the court been a backstop for it, and had more members of Congress been willing to vote against things based on their view that it was outside the constitutional norm for certain government activities to be federal rather than state. Number two, the question is one that I've long regarded as a moot one, because so much water has passed under that bridge since then. You can't go back. And once having given that vote to the people as a whole, you can't take it back and narrow the franchise, so to speak, give it to a small group of legislators. So it's not going to happen, and I think that's fine. I do think something changed, and my hope has always been that we can regain what we had before by educating voters, individual citizens, so that they understand that they lose something when their senators don't look out for the interests of the state. And I call them the prerogatives, the authorities of the state, rather than states' rights. Rights are things that are possessed by humans, and they come from God, not from government. They are protections against government action. Governments have authority. They have coercive force at their disposal. They don't have rights. And so this relates to something else that I see sometimes from those who have a different view of government. People will say you have a right to a certain income, or you have a right to government-provided health care, things like that. I think that is dangerously conflating the concept of rights with what someone might regard as good policy. Rights are things that the government cannot do to you. They're not things the government must provide for you at someone else's expense.
So my question is, If possible, how can we bring effective change and awareness to state monopolization of coercion and violence?
Operate always with an eye of skepticism toward government, in the same way that you would in any other circumstance. I love Senator Paul's analogy to medicine, in that medical doctors are experts. They've got tools and skills and knowledge that the rest of us don't have. And yet, ultimately, the surgeon isn't the one who has to live with the outcome. That's why it's ultimately the decision of the patient and the patient's family. They're the ones who have to live with the decision. And we should look at governments in much more that light than we have been. This is a conversation that is going to have to take place organically around the water cooler at work, around the dinner table at home, in our church congregations, with our friends, our neighbors, our aunts, our uncles, even the crazy ones. And we just need to talk about what government is and what it isn't. Because our schools aren't teaching that anymore. They're not telling us about the risk inherent in the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. They're not telling us that government is just coercive force. But if we have those conversations, it won't matter what they tell us. And you can make that difference just by those conversations you'll have around the water cooler and the dinner table.
I would also say that those who read books and read history, and I say that, people say, well, everybody does. No, almost no one reads anymore. Those who read books will be the leaders of the next generation. You want to be the leaders of the next generation? Steep yourself in our history. Steep yourself in the ideas of this. So my interns, we give them The Law by Bastiat, and it's a great book. He's a 19th century parliamentarian, a free trader, but he was also a guy who, one of the main themes of the book, The Law, is that what is immoral for an individual is immoral for a government, and you should look at it that way. So if it's immoral for me to come to your house and steal your car, it's immoral for the government to come and take it. If you've got 3 cars and I have no cars and the government takes one of your cars and gives it to me, that's just equally as immoral as me stealing the car. And I think that's an important way to do it, and we don't often look at it that way. It really is immoral. It's immoral to have a $25 trillion debt because we're borrowing from your future. It's going to eventually have effects on your ability to get a job. It's going to have effects on the economy for years to come, what we've done with exploding this debt. And that's immoral, and it's wrong. It's wrong individually. It's wrong on any kind of sense of good and evil. It's just wrong, what we're doing to you. And I think that's important. But reading is incredible, and I think we've lost that. When I was a kid, I still remember the fascination of learning to read. I remember the fascination of going through biographies and learning the history of our country. And we've lost so much of that. But if you will be part of the group that does read, and then you get actively involved, some of you will get elected to Congress. Some of you will be the leaders in your community. And that isn't always what you want to aspire to. It may be, but it may be being a leader in your community where you help others get elected, or maybe a leader in your community where you become the person who's in charge of United Way or in charge of a Salvation Army or a charity within your community. Equally as important, and on some days I would say much more important than probably the things we do here. But, it is reaching out and doing something, and I think also believing that anybody can do it. So many times people think, we live in a country of 330 million people, what could I possibly do? I promise you, if you take the bull by the horns, if you go out there and actually actively participate, you can have a big effect on what becomes of our country. But liberty has to be defended. It is not easy. The arguments for liberty are much more difficult, because what happens, and I tell those people all the time, that's why we have to be 10 times worse than those who are for big government. Big government can give you concrete things. So big government can give you a cell phone. They could give you a car. They could give you free education if they take the money from someone else. What we're offering isn't free stuff, because it has to come from someone else. What we're offering you is opportunity and intangible. So we have to be a heck of a salesman to sell to people who are freely voting that we're not going to give you something. We're not going to give you your neighbor's car. We're not going to give you anything. We're going to give you the freedom to have the opportunity to strive, and from that comes great prosperity. But we have to be able to convince people of that. But I think your generation can, but it's incredibly important. If you don't, it will slip away from us, because the tide is always in favor of those giving away something. So by all means, help us. Maybe one more?
This will be the last one.
So we talked a lot about the free market, and I was curious as to how we can feasibly phase out government social programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but as well motivate the free market to kind of pick up the slack and help those that benefit from those programs.
Once a program like Social Security and Medicare is in place and people have paid into it for not only years, but decades, and in fact generations at a time, those things are virtually impossible to eliminate, and in fact, in many ways, it would be unfair to eliminate it. It's never going to happen, but even if it did happen, you'd be treating unfairly those who had been promised, you pay into this, we'll take care of that. So what I've long aspired toward is at least stop expanding those fields, in part for that reason, and try to create as robust an economic environment as you possibly can where people can make choices. Economic growth gradually will make those things less necessary and less appealing, less the central focus of everything else. And so when we continually focus back on the inherent, innate dignity of the human soul and the fact that all of us are given the ability to live, to breathe, to live out our lives as we see fit. That's something that everyone can accept. Nobody, whether they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, whatever, they're not going to disagree with you on that. So if you focus on that, that ultimately takes you to liberty. And the reason for that is that we have learned through our collective experience as human beings that when human beings are given a little authority, as they suppose, they will tend inevitably to start to abuse that authority, to exercise what I call unrighteous dominion. And that the real way that human beings should influence each other is through meekness, kindness, gentle persuasion, and not through coercive force. When we understand the relationship between humans and government that way, when we understand that we're trying to elevate the condition of the human soul and to show each other respect, that's how we get to a better place, where there's more prosperity, where there's more kindness, there's more peace, there's more civility. In short, there's more love.
I would add to that it's important that we not equate government assistance with charity. They're completely separate and different things. And one is incredibly noble, and the other is really taking someone's money and then trying to apply it to a purpose such as a social good. They aren't the same, and there is something incredibly rewarding for each individual in giving and trying to help people in their community, and that's charity. The other thing I would say is that we have a lot of government programs, and part of the problem is over time they are crowding out the charitable sort of nature of the people. They say, well, why should I build houses for people? The government's doing it. But the interesting thing is, you would have thought after 50 years of the government doing this, there'd be no charity left. We're still an incredibly charitable nation. And the other thing is as you see the way government programs work, even social assisted programs, charitable type of government programs, are so poorly run that the marketplace of private charity still steps in. You think of Habitat for Humanity building lots, thousands of houses. The one that my wife and I are most proud of that we work with is helpingahero.org, which is building houses for severely wounded veterans. We have lots of programs for veterans, but this is extraordinary. And it's probably actually one of the best things I've been involved with. We had in our neighborhood, one of our friends hosted the fundraiser for this, and people were writing $5,000 and $10,000 checks and saying, thank you for letting me be part of this. When this gentleman's house was built, he lost both of his legs and an arm in Afghanistan. When his house was built, most of the workers wouldn't take pay, the general contractor wouldn't take profit, the utilities were donated. It was like a $400,000 house all of a sudden built for like $20,000 or $30,000 cost because nobody would be paid. And it was extraordinary, and we don't see enough of that anymore. And I think because government got in place of it, but to see a community coming together and doing things, it used to be in the old days and still is like in the Amish or the Mennonite community, if a house burns, everybody gets together and builds a house, or if a new couple is married, everybody gets together and builds their house for them, their first house. That's the kind of community spirit that I think is important that government crowds out. And really, don't ever let anybody say that government is, assistance is the same as charity. Charity is much better. And then I'll finish with this. The reason private charity is so much better is it's also mixed in with faith often, and government isn't. So you say you want to cure addiction, and we throw billions of dollars at it from the federal government. The best addiction programs involve faith and work. And government doesn't know anything about faith and probably shouldn't be involved in faith. They don't know anything about work either. They've got not a clue about work. But when you combine all three of those together, you'll meet people who successfully can overcome addiction. And it's a difficult thing. Not everybody can overcome it, but the ones who do, I see are in actually private programs. So I'm just never lose sight of that. No matter how big government gets, we've got to have private charity. It's the only thing that works. But it's the only thing that truly warms the soul is when you actually give it voluntarily. Thanks, everybody, for being part of this. Thank you, Senator Lee, for being part of this. And until next time.